The room was large and bright, filled with tall glass walls that let the sunlight pour inside. The table was long and polished, surrounded by men in dark suits and shining shoes, and at the head of the table sat the man everyone respected and feared, the billionaire Mr. Harrington. His sharp eyes and cold smile made people nervous wherever he went. His words carried weight, his laugh carried power, and his arrogance filled the air like a heavy shadow into this world of wealth and power. Stepped a young woman, her footsteps soft but steady. Her simple dress and quiet face made her look out of place among the glittering watches and silk ties. Yet her presence was undeniable. The moment she walked in, every head turned. Whispers followed, and even the assistants standing by the wall exchanged looks of surprise, for nobody expected her to be the one chosen for this contract signing. Nobody could imagine why she was there at all. She walked to the chair waiting for her at the far end of the table, her hands holding a folder close to her chest. Her eyes lowered but not weak. There was a fire behind them, though hidden from the quick glances of the men around her. She sat down carefully, her back straight, her breathing calm, though inside her heart raced, for this was no ordinary meeting. This was a moment that could change everything. Mr. Harrington leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, his gaze fixed on her as though she were a child who had wandered into a place she did not belong. His lips curved into a thin smile, the kind of smile that was not kind at all, the kind of smile that promised mockery. Yet she kept her silence. She placed the folder on the table and slowly opened it, revealing the contract that had brought her there. The men around the table shifted in their seats, some with curiosity, some with doubt. None of them dared speak, for they knew that the billionaire controlled the room, and his mood would decide how the meeting would go. Still, they wondered who she was, why she had been invited, what secret lay behind her quiet face. Because the deal at hand was worth millions, perhaps billions, and it was not something usually entrusted to someone so young and ordinary. She picked up the pen lying near the contract, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface. Her hand trembled slightly, but she tightened her grip and steadied herself. She lowered her eyes to the first page and began to read quickly. She already knew the words by heart. Every line had been studied again and again, but still she wanted to show care. She wanted them to see that she did not rush, that she understood, even though many of them thought she was too small for such a role. A sudden cough echoed through the room. It was Mr. Harrington. He leaned forward, his smile now sharper. His eyes narrowing as he watched her, his voice rose, smooth but filled with hidden laughter. He said softly enough to sound polite but loud enough for all to hear, "Does she even know what she is signing? Does she even understand the numbers on that page? Perhaps she thinks this is just a school paper. Perhaps she believes this is a game." The men chuckled under their breath, afraid to laugh too loudly but unwilling to resist his humor. Her cheeks burned, but she did not look up. She let the words fall around her like stones, heavy and sharp but not enough to break her. She continued reading, her hand moving slowly toward the signature line, the pen shining in her grip. Her silence filled the room more strongly than any answer she could have given, and that silence made some of the men uneasy, for they could not tell if she was frightened or if she was simply waiting for the right moment to speak. The air grew heavy. The sound of the city outside seemed far away. The ticking of the clock on the wall grew louder, and all eyes remained fixed on her. Each second stretched long as she turned the pages, steady and calm, never rushing, never stopping, until she finally reached the final page, the one that held the line where her name must be written. She lifted the pen, her hand no longer trembling, her eyes lifting just slightly. Catching the light from the window, for a brief moment her gaze met Mr. Harrington's, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. A spark, a challenge. Though she said nothing, he felt it, and for the first time his smile faltered just a little, though quickly hidden again. She lowered her eyes once more and bent over the page. The pen touched the paper, and the first stroke of her signature began to form. Soft whispers moved around the table, the sound of pens tapping and shoes shifting, but all grew quiet again as they watched her write. The young woman who seemed so fragile yet carried herself with such calmness. The woman who dared sit across from a billionaire and sign a contract that others would have feared to touch. No one knew her story yet. No one knew the battles she had fought to arrive at this very moment. But soon they would learn. Soon they would see that her presence was not an accident. Soon they would realize that every step she took into that room was part of something far greater. And as the final curve of her signature glided across the paper, the suspense grew heavier. For deep inside the air there was a sense that something powerful was about to happen, something that would leave the entire room stunned and silent. The pen was still in her hand when a sudden laugh echoed across the grand room, a laugh sharp and cutting. It came from the very end of the table where Mr. Harrington sat leaning back in his tall chair, his shoulders shaking as if the sight of her writing her name was the most amusing thing he had seen all week. His voice followed soon after, deep and smooth yet filled with mockery. He said, "Look at her hands, they shake like leaves in the wind. Does she even know what she is signing? Does she even understand the value of these numbers? Or does she think she is signing a letter to a friend?" The men around the table glanced at one another nervously. Some forced a weak laugh to please him. Others looked down at their papers. Afraid of meeting his eyes, the air grew tense, for no one wished to offend the billionaire, yet no one could ignore the way his words cut at the young woman who sat calmly across from him. She lowered her eyes to the contract, her lips pressed tightly together, her silence stronger than any defense. Mr. Harrington continued, his fingers drumming on the polished table. He leaned forward, his smile wide and cruel. He said, "This contract is worth more than she has ever seen in her life. It holds figures that could buy cities, yet here she is, a girl with no title, no history, daring to touch it as if she belongs among us. Tell me, gentlemen, do you not find this amusing?" And again, weak laughter filled the room, bouncing off the glass walls, filling every corner, though the sound was uneasy, for even those who laughed felt a strange weight pressing upon them as they watched her. Her hand did tremble. That much was true. But not from fear. Her heart beat fast, but her mind was sharp. She knew the contract line by line. She had studied every word under dim lights, through long nights. Her trembling was not weakness, but the tremor of destiny. The moment of change. The moment her life and the lives of those she cared for would take a new shape. She held the pen firmly again, pressing its tip against the final line. And though laughter filled her ears, she let it pass as though it were only the rustling of dry leaves outside. The assistants near the wall exchanged glances. Even they felt something different about her. Her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who carried secrets, someone who carried fire deep inside, a fire unseen by the men in their fine suits. They whispered softly to one another, wondering who she truly was, why she had been invited here, and whether she had more strength than she showed. Mr. Harrington raised his glass of water and sipped slowly, his mocking smile never leaving his face. He said, "Perhaps she believes this contract makes her powerful. Perhaps she thinks she has achieved something today. Yet power is not written in ink. Power is not gained by a stroke of the pen. Power is something she will never hold. Not while I sit at this table. Not while I control everything in this city." And his words carried arrogance that filled the room, pressing against everyone, forcing them to nod in agreement even if they wished to stay quiet. But she did not answer. She kept her eyes on the page. She signed slowly, her name unfolding across the paper with steady strokes, her breathing deep and calm now. She could feel every eye upon her, could hear every whisper, every suppressed laugh, yet her mind was far away, remembering the faces of those who had trusted her, the voices of those who had believed in her, the promises she had made. And each letter she wrote was not just ink, but the weight of those promises. When she placed the pen down, a hush spread across the room. The laughter died quickly, replaced by a silence that seemed heavier than before. Mr. Harrington narrowed his eyes, his smile fading just a little. He had expected her to falter, to defend herself, to cry, but she had done none of those things. Instead, she had answered his mockery with action, with calmness, and now the silence pressed back against him. One of the men near the center cleared his throat nervously. He asked softly if the papers should be checked again, but his voice was ignored, for the attention was still locked on her. She folded her hands neatly and lifted her head at last. Her eyes calm, her face serene, she looked directly at the billionaire, and though she spoke no words, her gaze carried something that unsettled him, something he could not name. The billionaire leaned back again, trying to hide his discomfort. He laughed once more, though softer this time. He said, "Perhaps the little girl thinks she has made a clever move. Perhaps she believes her silence is strength. But soon she will learn. Soon she will see how small she is." And yet, even as he spoke those words, he felt an unease growing within him, a whisper in the back of his mind that perhaps she was not as simple as he thought. Perhaps her silence was more dangerous than any answer she could have given. And so the room sat caught between his laughter and her quiet strength, caught between arrogance and mystery, the tension building, the suspense thickening, every man watching, every thought unspoken, waiting for what would happen next. For deep down they all felt it, a shift in the air, the beginning of something they could not stop. And though they did not know it yet, the billionaire who mocked her would soon be the one silenced. Silenced not by power or wealth, but by the very woman he had tried to humiliate. The woman whose response was yet to come and would change everything. The contract lay signed on the table, the ink still fresh, the paper glowing under the bright lights of the conference room. Everyone stared at it as if it were something alive, something that carried a hidden power, and in truth it did, though only she knew the truth of what those pages meant. Her hands rested calmly on the folder now closed, her face serene, her breathing steady, while inside her chest her heart thundered like a storm. The men in the room shifted uncomfortably. They whispered among themselves, none brave enough to speak too loudly. They had watched her endure every cruel laugh, every sharp word from the billionaire, and though she had seemed small and fragile, something about her calmness unsettled them. Silence often speaks louder than noise, and in her silence they felt a strength they could not explain, a strength that did not belong to someone ordinary. Mr. Harrington leaned forward again, his cold eyes studying her, his smirk returning as if he could erase his brief discomfort. He tapped his finger on the contract and said, "This is nothing but ink, nothing but paper. Power belongs to those who can use it, not to those who sign it." He expected her to flinch, to lower her eyes, but she only looked at him quietly, and that quiet look burned deeper than any words could. She remembered the long nights she had spent studying that contract, nights where she sat by a small lamp while the city outside slept. She had gone through every line, every clause, every number, her eyes heavy with fatigue, her mind sharp with determination. She had promised herself she would not fail. She had promised her family that she would fight for them, for their dignity, for their future. And this paper that looked simple to everyone else was her weapon, her shield, her key to justice. Her father had once been crushed by men like Harrington, men who thought money was law, men who laughed while others cried. She had watched her family lose everything. She had seen her mother weep in silence. She had felt the cold bite of hunger, the sting of shame, and those memories were carved into her heart like stone. They gave her strength now, strength that the billionaire could not see, strength that no wealth could buy. The billionaire raised his voice again. Trying to reassert his control, he said, "This meeting is over. Let us celebrate, let us drink. The deal is done and I stand victorious." But his words felt empty, even to those who nodded politely. Something in the room had shifted, a quiet current flowing against him, and though no one could yet name it, they felt it pressing against their chests, making them restless. She sat still, her calmness unbroken. She did not rise, she did not clap. She simply folded her hands and kept her eyes on the table. The men noticed her stillness, and it made them nervous, for in that stillness there was patience, and patience was often more dangerous than anger. Mr. Harrington noticed too, though he pretended not to, and for the first time in years he felt the faint touch of unease crawling through his confidence. One of the younger men at the far side of the table leaned to whisper to his colleague. He said, "She knows something, I can feel it, she is not afraid. She has something we do not see," but his colleague hushed him quickly, afraid the billionaire might hear. Yet the whisper echoed in the air, feeding the tension. She finally moved, only slightly, lifting her hand to close the folder once more. The soft sound of paper snapping shut filled the room louder than it should have. Every ear caught it, every heart skipped. She then slid the folder carefully toward the edge of the table, her eyes lifting just enough to meet Harrington's. And in that small movement the entire balance of the room felt as though it tilted, as if invisible scales had begun to shift. Her eyes were calm, steady, unblinking. They held no fear, no weakness, only a quiet fire. A fire that told him she was not here by accident. She was not a pawn. She was not a decoration. She was something else entirely. And though he could not yet understand it, he felt it in his bones. And for a brief second his smirk faltered again. The silence stretched, long and heavy. The ticking clock seemed louder. The city outside seemed distant. Everyone waited for her to speak, to explain, to reveal why she carried herself with such certainty. But she did not. Her silence was her armor. Her silence was her message, and it pierced them all deeper than any speech could. Mr. Harrington finally broke the silence. His voice harsher now, his arrogance covering his unease, he said, "Speak then. If you have something to say, let us hear it. Let us know why you sit so calmly when you should be grateful." But she did not answer. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her lips curved ever so faintly as if at a private thought. And that faint curve was more unsettling than words. The men shifted again, their curiosity growing, their confusion rising. They wondered if the billionaire had walked into a trap, if the woman they had mocked was actually holding the strings. They wondered what secret hid behind that calm face, what truth lay in the papers she had just signed, and their hearts beat faster as they realized the game had only begun. For her quiet strength was no act. It was real, it was deep, it was built from pain, from sacrifice, from battles unseen, and it was about to change everything, though the room did not know it yet. Though Harrington refused to believe it, though laughter still lingered in the air, beneath it all the ground had already begun to shift, and the silence was only the beginning of the storm to come. The room was heavy with silence, every eye still fixed on her, every breath drawn in suspense, and for a moment it felt as if the walls themselves leaned in closer, waiting for her next move. The billionaire sat stiff in his chair, his lips pressed together, his fingers twitching against the polished table. He had mocked her, laughed at her, dismissed her, yet she had not broken. She had not spoken a single word, and somehow her silence had begun to turn against him. She slowly reached forward and pulled the folder back to her side, her hands calm, her movements steady. She opened it again with care, the sound of the paper crackling loud in the tense air. She turned to one page in particular, her fingers brushing the corner with precision. Then she lifted her eyes and spoke for the first time since the signing, her voice soft but strong, clear enough to cut through the room like a blade. She said, "Mr. Harrington, do you realize what you have just agreed to?" The men looked at one another in confusion. Whispers spread quickly across the long table. Some leaned forward trying to see the page she pointed at. Others simply stared at her, wondering what she meant. The billionaire frowned, his face hardening. He said in a cold voice, "I know very well what I agreed to. I agreed to a deal that makes me richer, that makes me stronger. What else could it mean?" But her steady gaze did not waver. She tapped the page with her finger, her calm expression unbroken, and she said, "Look closely. You overlooked this clause. You were too sure of yourself, too quick to laugh, too eager to mock me. You did not read the words hidden in plain sight." The men leaned in now, their curiosity burning, their eyes searching the lines she had marked, and slowly realization spread among them, their faces shifting from doubt to surprise, from surprise to shock. The clause she pointed to was simple but powerful. It stated clearly that all major decisions tied to this contract must pass through her signature, that her approval was needed for every move, every investment, every change. Without her, the contract had no life. Without her, nothing could move forward. And as those words sank into the minds of the men around the table, the air seemed to shiver. Mr. Harrington's smirk vanished. His eyes widened as he leaned forward, snatching the paper to read it himself. His hands gripping the edges tightly, his lips moving as he whispered the words he had missed, words he thought unimportant, words that now burned against him like fire. The silence grew deeper, every man watching him, waiting for his reaction, and for the first time the mighty billionaire looked uncertain. She sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing even, her eyes fixed on him without fear, and though she spoke softly, her words struck like thunder. She said, "This is not your victory. This contract does not belong to you alone. You cannot move without me. You cannot decide without me. Every step you take will now depend on my approval." And that was the moment the weight of her plan unfolded before them all. The men gasped quietly, some covered their mouths. Some sat back in shock. None dared to laugh now. They realized what had happened. The very girl the billionaire mocked had turned the game on him. She had placed herself at the heart of his empire, not through loud words or bold claims, but through patience, intelligence, and silence. And now her position was undeniable. Mr. Harrington slammed the paper onto the table, his voice rising in anger. He said, "This is a trick, this is a lie." Yet his words sounded weak, hollow. He knew the paper was real. He knew the signatures were valid. He knew he had signed without reading carefully, too full of arrogance, too sure of himself. And now he was trapped, caught in the very deal he had thought would crush her. She leaned forward slightly, her calm eyes never leaving his. And she said, "You thought silence was weakness. You thought humility was fear. But silence can hold power. Humility can hold strength. And now you will see what true strength looks like." Her words echoed through the room, steady and sharp, each one cutting through the air and striking deep into the pride of the billionaire. The men around the table looked at her with new eyes, no longer seeing a fragile girl, no longer seeing an intruder. They saw a strategist, a fighter, someone who had faced humiliation and turned it into triumph. And though they said nothing, though they kept their eyes lowered, respect had already begun to bloom quietly in their hearts. The billionaire sat frozen, His anger boiling, yet his hands shaking. He could not find words, his voice failed him. His mind raced to find a way out. But the contract was clear. The ink was real. And the room that once laughed with him now stared in silence. Not at him, but at her. The woman he had mocked. The woman who now controlled what he thought was his. And so the balance of power shifted before their eyes. The once mighty billionaire silenced by his own arrogance. The young woman rising not through wealth, not through noise, but through wisdom, patience, and courage. And though this was only the beginning, though battles still lay ahead, in that moment she had won the room. She had taken the first victory, and nothing would ever be the same again. The air inside the grand room felt heavier than stone. Every man seated at the long table stared at the contract as if it were a blade resting against their throats. Their hearts raced, their palms sweated, and still no one dared to speak. For the only sound was the shallow breathing of Mr. Harrington, the billionaire who had always commanded every meeting, who had always spoken louder than all others. Now sat pale and speechless. He tried to laugh. His lips curved, but no sound came. He tried to raise his voice, but his throat closed. He felt a pressure inside his chest as though the very walls had turned against him. The ink on the paper mocked him now. Every letter reminding him of his arrogance, reminding him of how he had laughed, of how he had called her weak, of how he had thought she was nothing. Yet she sat across from him calm and steady, her silence stronger than any roar. The men at the table shifted nervously. Some avoided his eyes, some dared to glance at her, and in those glances respect began to bloom. Respect they never thought they would give to her. The woman who had walked in quietly now stood taller in their minds than the man they once feared. Her calm strength had broken the spell of his wealth. It had shown them something deeper, something real. Mr. Harrington clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his face red with fury, yet still he had no words. He opened his mouth, but his voice betrayed him. Coming out thin and weak, he said, "This cannot be, this cannot happen." Yet the paper lay before him like truth carved in stone. Unchangeable, undeniable, unshakable. His pride cracked, his power slipping through his fingers, and the silence of the room pressed down upon him like a heavy crown of shame. She did not move quickly. She did not rush to take advantage of the moment. Instead, she remained still, her eyes steady, her breathing calm. She let the silence grow thicker, for she knew silence was her ally. Every second that passed without his voice was a victory. Every glance the men gave her instead of him was proof of her rise. She did not need to boast, she did not need to shout. Her power was already shaping itself before their eyes. The assistants by the wall exchanged looks, their eyes wide, their hands gripping their notepads tightly. They had never seen the billionaire quiet. They had never seen him shaken. They whispered softly to one another. She silenced him. Can you believe it? She silenced him. Their whispers spread like sparks, feeding the fire of the moment, making it brighter, making it unforgettable. The billionaire slammed his hand on the table at last, the sound sharp, echoing against the glass walls. Yet even that strike felt hollow. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support. But none of the men dared to nod, none dared to laugh, none dared to back his anger. Their loyalty had already begun to shift, their fear of him melting slowly into doubt, their curiosity pulling them toward her, toward the quiet woman who had turned the game upside down. She lifted her head slightly, her lips parting, and she spoke again. Her voice soft yet unbreakable. She said, "Power is not about who laughs the loudest. Power is not about who owns the tallest tower. Power is about control, and control is mine now." Her words flowed like water, clear and unstoppable. They struck deep into the ears of everyone present. They pierced the pride of Mr. Harrington, leaving him silent once more. One of the men closest to her bowed his head slightly in respect. Another shifted forward as if to hear her more clearly. The billionaire noticed this betrayal. His heart burned with rage, but what could he do? His own arrogance had handed her the key. His own laughter had blinded him, and now his empire was tied to her pen, tied to her approval, tied to the very woman he had humiliated moments before. The clock on the wall ticked louder with each passing second, each tick a reminder of his silence, each tick a reminder that the power in the room had changed hands. The men who once hung on his every word now waited for her, their eyes filled with awe, their faces heavy with the weight of realization. They knew history was unfolding before them. They knew nothing would be the same. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but her presence commanding. She did not gloat. She did not mock him back. She let the silence remain. For silence was stronger than any insult. Silence was louder than any laughter, and in that silence the billionaire was trapped. Stripped of his control, stripped of his pride, left with nothing but his own mistake. The men would later remember this moment. They would remember the way his face lost color, the way his words failed, the way her quiet strength rose above him. They would tell the story again and again. The story of how a young woman silenced a man who thought he could never be silenced. And every time they told it, their respect for her would grow. Their belief in her would deepen. Their loyalty would shift. And so the billionaire sat frozen, silent, humiliated, powerless, while she remained calm, unbroken, and in control. And though the meeting had not ended yet, though battles were still to come, everyone in that room knew the truth. Everyone could feel it in their bones. The mighty billionaire had fallen, and the quiet woman he mocked had risen above him, her silence ringing louder than his wealth, her presence commanding more than his power. And in that silence she became unforgettable. The room was still, every man seated around the long table staring at her as if they had never seen her before. The billionaire who once ruled them all sat silent, his pride shattered, his words gone, his power stripped away by his own arrogance. And yet the young woman across from him remained calm, her presence unshaken, her silence stronger than stone. The air pressed heavy on every chest, for they all knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. She slowly rose from her chair, her movements graceful, her eyes scanning the room, each face turned toward her, some filled with awe, some filled with fear, but all filled with respect. She picked up the folder with the signed contract, her hand steady, her back straight, and in that simple act the entire balance of the room seemed to shift once again, as if the very ground beneath them bowed to her quiet strength. Her voice rose then, soft yet firm, carrying to every corner of the grand room. She said, "Power is not measured in how much money one holds. Power is not measured in how many men bow in fear. Power is measured in wisdom, in patience, in knowing when to speak and when to stay silent." She turned her gaze directly to Mr. Harrington, her eyes steady as fire. "And she said, you laughed at me because you thought silence was weakness. But today silence has defeated you." Gasps filled the room. The assistants at the wall covered their mouths. The men at the table leaned closer. Every word she spoke wrapped around their hearts like chains, binding them to the truth she carried. She did not shout. She did not boast. But her calm voice rang louder than thunder. And in that calm voice they heard authority. They heard victory. They heard the rise of someone who had turned pain into strength. Mr. Harrington's eyes burned with shame. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight. Yet he could not answer. He could not fight back. The contract lay against him. The silence chained him, and her words crushed the pride he had built for years. He lowered his eyes at last, and in that lowering every man saw what had happened. The mighty had fallen, the humble had risen, the arrogant had been silenced. She walked slowly toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each step echoing in the silent hall. The men followed her with their eyes, unable to look away, as though drawn to her by a force greater than wealth, greater than fear, greater than power. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting gently against the frame. She turned once more, her eyes meeting theirs, and she spoke again, her words sharp and unforgettable. She said, "Remember this day. Remember that humility is not weakness. Remember that silence is not emptiness. Remember that respect is not given to the loudest voice but to the strongest spirit. And one more thing. Never mistake a calm heart for a powerless one." Her voice lingered in the air long after she finished, every man repeating her words in his mind, every man feeling the weight of her truth. The billionaire shifted in his seat, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly. He wanted to fight, he wanted to scream, but the weight of her words crushed him. The shame of his mockery burned him. The sting of his own arrogance silenced him again. He bowed his head without meaning to, his silence now deeper than ever. And in that bow the room saw his defeat more clearly than if he had spoken. She gave a final nod, small but powerful. Then she turned and stepped out into the bright hallway beyond. The doors closed behind her with a quiet thud, leaving the men inside staring at one another in silence. The assistants whispered again, their voices trembling. They said, "She has changed everything. She has defeated him. She has become someone unforgettable." And their whispers spread like waves, carrying her name into places she had never yet walked. Outside the glass walls the sun shone brighter. The city roared with life, and she walked with steady steps, the folder in her hands no longer heavy but light, for she had carried not just a contract. She had carried her strength, her patience, her pain, and she had turned it into victory. She remembered the nights she had cried alone, the mornings she had risen despite despair, the promises she had whispered to herself, and she knew every sacrifice had brought her here. She paused at the top of the steps outside the great building, her eyes lifting to the sky, the wind brushing against her face, and she whispered softly, though no one was near. She whispered, "Father, Mother, this victory is for you, for every tear, for every loss, for every moment we were crushed. Today the world has heard me. Today silence has spoken louder than gold." Her words carried away by the breeze but etched forever in her heart. And so her story spread, from that room to every ear that would listen. The story of the young woman who entered in silence, who endured mockery, who signed her name with courage, and who silenced the billionaire with wisdom, patience, and strength. A story that would be told again and again, reminding all who heard it that true power is not in money, not in arrogance, not in laughter at another's pain, but in dignity, in calmness, and in the fire of a humble heart.